Thank you. Thank you, Dennis. What an exciting introduction, and I'm really looking forward to speaking with Isaac and Greg afterwards. I think you'll find that the three of us have very different angles, but what the panel does is converge each of these agendas. I don't know, I'm not really touching anything. I don't know if I'm doing something wrong. But what I'll try to start with is to show you one project, to explain some of the theories that I work with more broadly in research, and to also touch on some of my academic teachings. So I practice, I exhibit, I speculate, I build, I install, and for me, different media, different formats, they all just create more contingencies in the work. So there is really no difference for me between 1 to 1 million and 1 to 1. It's how we work to scale, and we develop our scales and our tools along the way. In particular, I'm a landscape architect. Just to give you a little grounding, I teach in landscape architecture, but I also co-direct, as Dennis mentioned, a program for postgraduate students in risk and resilience that really pushes up against the definitions that we're using in design fields with the term resilience. So what I hope to explain and really sorry, I'm going to see if this works. What I'm going to show you this morning is really one project that is not, as Dennis mentioned, I'm working on a project that is a 2.5-year study in Miami Beach. Specifically, we're coordinating with Civil Works in Miami Beach, but I won't be showing you that project. It's not public yet, but I will be glad to come back at this time next year, and I can show you some of the work. Meanwhile, tricky extremes on barrier islands is certainly a thread in any case. But what I'm going to try to convince you of this morning is a different role for plants, let's say, and plant life as a natural resource that we see as fixed in place. So hopefully by the time you leave today, you have a different idea of this kind of unique form of living material that we use, especially as landscape architects, that too often we materialize as something called green. And so the key to that is bridging the gap between the natural and social sciences. So this is what my own research agenda attends to, this overwhelming gap between what we can do with plants and what plants are actually doing. That is also the difference between form and formation. Architecture describes form, landscape architecture describes formation. If you can remember that as students, then it really starts to bridge how we work and how we develop, and also the differences in the fields. So plants move, plants behave, and plants exhibit behaviors that are predictable. I'm going to wear my academic hat for a moment, but these are diagrams drawn after The Power of Movement in Plants, which is one of Charles Darwin's least known publications. He did the experiments with his son Francis, and he basically charted the contact points, angles, and momentum that are accumulated through plant development. Plants did not just grow or simply increase in size, they could progress powerfully through the environment. The consequences presented an understanding of plant life as a kind of succession of developments that collaborate to survive. Can you hear me if I'm over here or if I'm over here? Yes? Okay. So each meticulous experiment, of which there are hundreds, embedded in this study, project movement and a kind of rise of plant physiology and biomechanics, which are more commonly described in contemporary science. And they demonstrate the evolution that could account for behavioral response. So Darwin's long-term interest in these adaptive qualities of plants is substantiated by both his publication and the studies, and yet plant movement is still one of his most unfamiliar achievements. Here you can see how that starts to manifest in the document. Now, Darwin's analysis didn't just interpret plant movement from a distance. I'm a human, I'm going to study plant life, which is very typically how we treat the natural environment. Instead, the analogy to that is the aerial view or the environmental cue that landscape architects and architects use so often. Instead, Darwin really collaborated with the entire plant organism. He suspended a glass plate above the growing tips of each seedling and glued a glass needle to their shoots so that the plants themselves could trace their own progress across the plate and in time with this kind of sticky wax that allowed Darwin and his son to record these movements using key points on other sides of the plate. So the ensuing diagrams present a model of plant formation, the registration of the plant organism as a sequence of traceable, knowable, isolated activities that when taken together express universal movement. So plants, in his conclusion especially, Darwin's very known for putting all of his best work in his last few paragraphs. The proof is really that the influence of light, gravity, water, all of these things that we take as environmental cues are not, in fact, forming the plant, but the plant is forming its way through space. So plants are not dependent on the environment. They exploit it just as humans and animals do in order to advance their own species. Repeating the experiments from root to shoot, Darwin proves that every part of every plant is continually in motion. Now, again, this depends on scale. We understand scale so well as architects and landscape architects. So the plant, any plant, is not an object, it is a swarm. If you can get there with me, the same cellular distribution is available in the root or the shoot, the radical or the shoot. In other words, the tip of the root is the same on a cellular level as the tip of a leaf. So the entire plant is one organic swarm. These slowly dividing cells don't just grow from a fixed place, but they display complex behavior that enables them to progress and adapt. Because they move more slowly than humans, they're infinitely more adaptable to environmental cues. Now, I'm personally much more interested in adaptation versus mitigation in my work. So taking the adaptability of plants becomes a cue to how we may use the environmental cues and adapt ourselves rather than mitigate the environment, which is too often the case. So again, just to remind you that this is all one plant, no matter the scale. As soon as you see the large scales, it's hard to remember that, especially because the roots are concealed, less so in Florida. Small movements in the plant accumulate environmental stimuli to describe the growth of new parts. Equally remarkable is Darwin's expression of the experiment, which I described, this kind of collaboration between the human scientist and the plant organism. So through operations such as the absorption of water by the rootlets and the exhalation of it by the foliage, Darwin confirms that plant movement is structured by physical laws but regulated by the living organism. Recall, again, root to shoot, that the plant first dives into the ground. You all remember your grade 10 science class and you see the seed. Before the plant makes its way into the air, it has to make its way into the ground. Pushing soil out of the way as it does so. And this, if you think of the millions and billions of seedlings out there, the reproductive capacity of just one organism is actually moving Earth. So, over a century ago, prior to ecology as a discipline even, Darwin confirms that it is not the environment that shapes plants, but it is plants that shape the environment. That plants move, sense, and behave has been surprisingly overlooked in the planning, management, and design of landscapes. Set against the dynamic effects of phenomena and topography, plants have typically been relegated to static backgrounds, either framing or setting the scene for animal or human action. What happens when we begin to attend to the plant as the center of the strategy instead of the static afterthought of the strategy and its appealing greening strategy that are currently accumulating, of course, too often through resilience planning, sea level rise, and other climate-based metrics. So I'm giving you a bit of a critique of resilience at the same time as I'm offering you a way forward as in terms of resilience planning. So in other words, what if the mobility and activity of plant life is included as a critical measure of the environment? But we have taken static form for so long that we've completely forgotten that plants move. Green organisms have emerged and evolved through a very differentiated relationship with time, distinguished by their continuous growth potential. This is termed intermediate growth. What intermediate growth means is that plants and roots, as you know, it's all the same thing, do not stop growing at a certain point in time or maturity. They only do so in relation to advantage or restriction. So in their progression, plants appear and disappear, clone themselves, or give rise to new descendants. Further, they are in constant competition with one another for resources. But typically, and despite Darwin's remarkable contribution, when plants move perceptibly, they tend to be an affront to humans. We label them as invasive, we worry for the other plant species, we become stewards of those that are weaker, and we call them out as aggressive. But the plant is simply devouring its climb for biological advantage. It is an intelligent organism. A plant's photosynthetic qualities, such as the green I showed you in the last slide, tend to be their most admired evolutionary feature, right? Leaves photosynthesize. But terrestrial implies fixity, yet their connection to the ground is actually as significant as their ability to synthesize light energy. So in human terms, being fixed is rarely considered an attribute, as advantage is endorsed by the agility of humans and animals. As a result, showy leaf and canopy structure command the most attention. This is especially the case in design practices, as form is outlined by yearly stages and seasonal variation only. There is no question that the magnificent vertical achievement of a plant is a testament to its health and energy, and it's beautiful. Nevertheless, terrestrial flora is also rooted. It is connected to a substrate that lends the above-ground parts its intelligence. For instance, if a part of the root system is destroyed, or even sustains marginal damage, a corresponding portion of the canopy will die. But that's not the case in reverse. Eradicating branches and leaves will not, if ever, affect the root system. So this idea that the roots are in place to grow the canopy, what if you reverse that and you understand that the canopy is in place to move the roots powerfully through space? Roots and rhizomes, as they move through the soil, slow to absorb nutrients, just as an animal might stop for an attractive meal. Darwin was astonished by this kind of similarity between plants and animals, comparing the tip of the radical to the brain of the animal. But there is more than one significant difference, of course, between animals on the one hand and plants on the other. The most useful distinction in making the case for movement is that plants evolve the ability to take in nutrients and subsequently reproduce from a series of stationary points where animals go in search of food and mates. So in terms of evolution, animals and humans evolved legs, and plants evolved very unique chemical communication. As a measure of mobility, plants in this chemical evolution humans and animals have much more in common, obviously, than plants, but the plant communication through chemical is a sensitivity and excitability that many times cannot be understood by human measure. This is very frustrating to humans, of course, that we cannot measure it and that we cannot communicate. So we do things like relegate roots to fixity, and we take behavior off the table, and we certainly don't speak of plants as movement. Nonetheless, they are actively communicating, behaving, and moving with visible prowess. On a really basic level, plants could do very well in the environment without humans, but humans cannot survive without plants. So you could also say, so what, right? This is a resilience colloquium. That's really great. That was fun. But once a plant is fixed for science, right? Really for scientific measure through botany and all of the ologies that come from it, it becomes a resource. And as a resource, we treat it as static form. A tree or a plant is there for the bloom, for the bark, for the wood, for the shade at times, for the berry. You could go down the list. This is what we inherit in the design field. We inherit a reliance on science that says what science says is what we know. Now, science itself is a history. The history of science is well known, but it is also designed. It is designed to elevate the current scientific paradigm. So things like Darwin's Power of Movement in Plants, which is very well read by certain botanists, especially behavioral botanists, are relegated to the shelf because other of Darwin's theories are elevated in turn. So this difficulty to measure and this difficulty to attend to behavior becomes grounded in a kind of speculation about plants. And the positivist kind of security of measure and knowing and being able to fix and label and find and measure and draw is a kind of same desire that we have to cut, copy, paste, and fill. And it is a simplicity that, unfortunately, relegates the plant to a fixed object. And so we plant plants as fixed objects. We design the topography, we design a resilient strategy. We have a lot of really good movement in policy recently, but plants stay fixed in place. For example, Ian McHarg and James Coroner. Landscape architecture, here relying on the references of plants as fixed form, no relationship to how a plant grows, reproduces, or moves. At the scale of ecological systems and terrestrial resources, plant movement actually becomes even more essential and significant than at the scale of the individual organism. The presumption that plant life is sessile and devoid of intelligence completely underestimates the qualities of its biological aliveness and ignores this creative collaboration required between human and plant life. If the ologies and isms of spatial practice could include botanical progress, then the planted world might be appreciated in wholly new ways. A reading of plants whereby fragmentation and fixity is perhaps superseded by formation and behavior. So again, this is the study of the vegetal unit, which is essentially superficial and descriptive in nature. But this does get projected onto the living environment, and it is our attention and focus as designers to either do so and repeat the times or establish a new relationship with plants. So I'm going to just talk for a moment about resilience itself, because I'm going to try to make the bridge by using one project in particular, the one that Dennis mentioned, to describe how plants themselves are resilient. And resilience is a behavioral attribute of plants. So what if we could use that behavioral attribute and bring it into resilience planning with a little more respect and admiration for the organism? So does anyone know where the first use of resilience in ecology came from? Do you cover this? Am I going to repeat? Where did the word resilience come from? It's just in the dictionary, right? So we can use it. I'll tell you, when most of us were at school 5, 10, 15, or 20 years ago, resilience wasn't a term that we were using. So ecology also was just emerging. But resilience was actually a term used at the microscopic level in describing elasticity in material sciences at the turn of the century. And it was appropriated from material sciences by someone named Buzz Halling, who many of you might know in the university down the street, if you will. Although Buzz Halling, C.S. Halling, is Canadian by birth. I'm Canadian. And it helped him explain complex systems dynamics in ecology. So he appropriated this term because there was this elasticity and the description of elasticity in material science, and he scaled it up to the scale of ecological systems. And he basically studied forests, and for most of his career. And despite the fact that the term itself is heavily debated, in every case since, the definition embraces the notion of a return to stability, right? Implicit in these kind of objectives of recovery. But the association between the amount of disturbance that a system could take was a result of the micro-relationships of the organisms, and that's what he put the term resilience toward, is, let's say, the micro-relationship between organisms in the same way that he scaled up from the microscope to, let's say, the tree or two trees interacting. So resilience was the absorbance of a shock that resulted in an alternative configuration, in his estimation, years of practice. And he called this the multi-stable state reality. So resilience wasn't a return to anything. It was actually an ability to create an alternative configuration because you learn from disturbance. You learn from disturbance, and then you create a new or an alternative configuration. An alternative configuration is not a solution, right? It is not a solution because if you look at a problem statement, which also comes to us from the sciences, the problem statement would be the forests are dying. This is a map of woody biomass that I was zoomed into. The forests are dying. Well, the solution would then be, let's put back the forest. But if we're talking about resilience, which is a phenomenal word, which I absolutely am behind, I just want it to be used more and more precisely so it doesn't go the wayside of other terms that we've seen come and go. Resilience actually says, let's bring that disturbance as a new form of knowledge and bring our species forward into an alternative configuration. So I think that is an incredibly fecund idea for designers because design is about a proposition. It is about an alternative configuration. It is not about returning to a past state of equilibrium. So, sorry, I have in my notes, I just have to read it because he starts his paper, which is available online, or I can send a link to Dennis, but I'm sure you'll find it if you just Google Halling resilience. He starts and he says, individuals die, populations disappear, and species become extinct. What a way to start a paper, right? It is phenomenal and it's worth the read. In any case, what's clear about that opening statement is also that he relates this alternative configuration to duration, meaning time and temporality. And he could justify these kind of monitoring periods between dormancy and decline in an ecosystem. What he actually discovered in his paper, he was studying the spruce budworm, by the way, which is, maybe most of you don't remember, but in the 80s, there was a budworm on the spruces. That would be Maine and north into Canada, and also on the west coast, let's say Portland north, which came into forests and absolutely decimated the spruce populations. And he was trying to figure out how some forests displayed resilience to this budworm and others did not. So some forests came back after the budworm had been in there, and some did not. And he actually found that old-growth forests, which ecologically we would say are the most stable communities, or we would say at the time, he found that it was the youngest first and second succession forests that displayed the most resilience. So once you are in a stable state, it is very difficult to display resilience. So resilience actually is a kind of novel form of instability, one that is predicated on high variability and an equilibrium, and behavior expressed far from equilibrium. So if you're in a stable state, like an old-growth forest, you're actually displaying the lowest resilience. So stable states have the lowest resilience. Now, if we are designing stable states as problem-solving mechanisms, then we are designing the lowest form of resilience as designers. And this is problematic because we have an incredible opportunity ahead of us, and in your generation especially. So how do we start to describe how instability can manifest in the environment? Does this look resilient? I mean, I think it's actually really important because what is happening more and more is that we're looking at the same construction detail, which is essentially an evolution of the Army Corps' Coastal Engineering Manual, the CEM, which designed seawalls in the 30s, which is essentially that profile. And we are taking that same profile and we are making it higher, and then we're greening it. And we're doing this everywhere. This is not here, my school's doing it. We're all doing it. I'm not being critical of it. No, of course I'm being critical of it. But I'm being critical of continuing to do it. We are in a moment where we are basically ourselves in a kind of instability. So what do? We go back to best practices. Of course we do. We have to. We have to maintain. We have to go on. We all want to keep going to the water and appreciating salt marshes and sitting with our families. There's no question. My research and what I'm offering to you today is how do we move beyond that? How do we get beyond that? Because otherwise we will keep funding this and it will keep getting higher and higher. Now in this, of course, unfortunately, the trees are fixed in place, right? There's no sign of root zone. Things are green so that you can get greening points. I don't have to go over that anymore. But what is problematic in the detail elevating is the kind of environmental narrative of decline, that something is lost, and we don't like losing things as humans. So what is lost? Typically in this situation, a salt marsh, or a view, or a recreational path. And so we bring it back. Of course, we have to bring it back bigger, better, and higher now. So what's happening, or I'm speculating, this combined authority between restoration and resilience is a new kind of collaboration whereby, as designers, if we're given a resilience project, we have to get into the narrative of restoration, which is why it's so interesting that you're both here. Because restoration, as Greg and I agree deeply, is not going back to a fixed state, but it's understanding the ecological evolution of that state and restoring what is possible and then bringing back what might not be as easy as the restoration. So I'm giving you this as also a catalyst for thinking about a very different model of resource management. Back to the sciences. Projections of future climates and ecology, like the retreat of mountain glaciers and the polar ice caps, the migration of forests and so on, are really just proposals made in spite of real ignorance about the critical physical and biological processes involved and the difficulty of actually evaluating them. That's a very powerful statement by Dr. Bierling. Now, that has an analogy to what I described at the beginning of plant behavior versus plant form, right? It's very, very difficult to evaluate these things, but we must continue to do so. What's tricky is when designers freeze a moment in scientific speculation and take that as fact, as given, and then design around that metric. So the same analogy of behavior in plants subdued because it's difficult and kind of tricky is I could apply, speculatively to how climate science is evolving. We are given a height or a datum as designers, and we will follow it. And then the height or datum will change, and more so, if you speak to a lot of climate scientists together, they're like, no, that's today's speculation. That's just today's speculation. Listen to Bierling here speaking to a public audience. It's all a question of what literature you're reading and which scientists you're reading. Now, in America, it's especially fraught, again, as restoration and resilience in the Northeast especially, and throughout America more and more are starting to overlap. So we have to decide as designers how to, actually let me pull back. Things are changing. This statement basically says things are changing. That's what we know. We don't know how they're changing, but we know that they're changing, and we're going to continue to monitor that. As designers, our role is not to figure out the climate science. That's absolutely not what I'm trying to speculate. If things are changing, how do we want them to change in the built environment and the living environment? That's what designers can attend to. How do we want them to change? Not they have to change this way because because 0.5 turned into 1, or I was just at a resilience conference at Columbia University, and it's understood now that 2.8 millimeters a year of sea level rise around New York City. Well, how are we going to take that? Where do we go with that? It's not a metric we really want to use. We want to understand change is occurring. We need systems that are flexible to that change, and then let go of the fixity of numbers, because environments are certainly changing. This is a salt marsh in Rhode Island. It's different than what you have here. Again, I'm not going to talk about the Miami project and the South Florida project, but I'm going to kind of segue into my work in Rhode Island, which was part of an interesting consortium I can describe later. So you're seeing a salt marsh. For those of you that don't know Northeast salt marshes, it's mostly a combination of two species, Iva and Spartina. And you have a lowland and an upland condition. I mean, that you're familiar with, right? Behind there, you have an upland condition, and down here, you have a bottomland condition. Now, first of all, we built in the bottomland condition. So you could start with that if you want to, but we won't even start with that. We'll say these people own homes, and they need to rebuild. What's more, they will rebuild on the same footprint at a higher elevation, and then the ecologists, the restoration ecologists especially, will come in and recommend that the salt marsh is replanted, first potentially elevated with dredge, and then replanted with Spartina. So we're putting things back a little higher, and we're calling it resilience planning. We could also say, why are we building in lowlands when we could build in uplands? And how do we start to influence and impact policy as designers to be able to look at how buyouts occur and how proper buildings, like if you're going to look at proper building standards, look at where you're building, right? And same as landscape architects. If we have to elevate, so I'm not going to comment on the building in the salt marsh. As a landscape architect, I couldn't take on a project that said we're going to fill this salt marsh with dredge, and then we're going to replant Spartina, because what the environmental disturbance is telling us is things are changing. Right? And it may be difficult for us to understand how things are changing, but there are clues. Over there you have a little hummock. You guys are more familiar with the word hummock down here, which is really nice, because in the Northeast it's like, what's a hummock? It does happen a lot, but that's a little hummock up there, right? You can see that. It's high ground, it has different species, usually a little harder wood. That is an ecological transition of the upland to the lowland. We could say it's invading the salt marsh, or we could say it's a clue that things are changing. So why put back Spartina when the hardwoods are really resilient to that disturbance? And that is what's happening in Rhode Island in particular, and what our work, we worked with a plant biologist as well as an ecologist, again, because we want to come from both sides. What you're seeing more and more is that salt marshes are accreting in the lowland condition, and with that subsidence, you have to remember that the second condition would be open water, right? I mean, this is subsiding, meaning it's going down. Therefore, it will become open water. Salt marshes are adjacent, right adjacent. I'm sorry, I don't have a map. Right adjacent the ocean and the tides. There's the upland condition, and so what Rhode Island is experiencing is, sorry, I don't have, okay, wait, I'm gonna get there. Sorry, I don't have the next slide thingy here. What's occurring is essentially that restoration and resilience are conflating, because restoration is coming in here and saying it will be more resilient if you have a salt marsh. It could, so let's talk about that. Same in terms of rebuilding. Here is before and after a disturbance, rather than understanding so clearly that a salt marsh needed an outlet in this area, right? They rebuild because of ownership lines and building standards, and they pave right back over the inlet outlet. So if it has taken us 200 years to accept plant behavior in the sciences, how long will it take to integrate climate science? Darwin talked about movement 200 years ago. Sorry, Goethe talked about movement 200 years ago. Darwin, 100 years ago. This is a long time, and it's still very difficult for us to understand that plants behave. So what if we start to take behavior of plants into consideration, including the entire organism, meaning radical to tip, the entire organism is one. How can we consider that the behavior of plants themselves provide the key to the deliberate manipulation, design, or fluctuation at the scale of ecology? So as I've said, I urge you to recognize the behavior and development of how plants act and react in order to underscore the study of behavior and formation, and not just context and topography. When disturbance occurs, forests come back in very different, more manipulatable and predictable behavioral attributes. So what we have more generally is replacing plant form with plant behavior, seeing ecological disturbance not as destructive, but as exciting, a new alternate configuration, and that coastal resilience is not stable and shouldn't be. So I'm going to show you the project which builds on that hummock idea and also on the hardwood forests in my remaining few minutes. Sorry, it's already been half an hour. I don't know how that happened. But I worked essentially with 3 agencies, the Army Corps of Engineers, the Coastal Resources Management Council, which is specific to Rhode Island, and then NRCS, which is also a federal agency, so 2 federal and 1 state agency with climate modeling coming out of Princeton University. I see Guy Nordenson is speaking soon. He was the principal working on the climate modeling side. And I'm sure he'll talk about that actually, but basically what he was speculating is, why are we using historic storms to predict climate change and sea level rise and surge values? Why aren't we using more synthetic storm metrics? So we were benefiting by the projections of the Adlinger Center at Princeton, and each school, we worked with 4 different schools, worked each on a different state, and we worked on Rhode Island, and we were speculating together. It was a very exciting project because we were collaborating. We each had a different state, but it wasn't a competition. I'm personally not drawn to competitions around resilience because I really don't think we should be competing. I think we should be collaborating a lot more than we are. Once you get out into the world as a professional, you realize that we're a very small part of the building environment, and we need to be able to share more. So I show you this because I'm also going to end with this slide. Is it very dark? But this is a sassafras stand in a salt marsh 2 years after Sandy. The salt marsh was still recovering from its restoration, as you can see in some of the spotty bits of the LiDAR, and the hardwood, the sassafras, was sprouting happily away. in this salt marsh. You could do one of two things. You could remove the sassafras, or you could see it as a transitional coastline, the beginning of a transitional coastline. So I'll speed through, but basically this was the general area of study. That's zooming into some of the restoration projects following Sandy, all Army Corps projects, which basically describes an armored coast. We have an armored coast. That's what it is. There's the path of Sandy. We chose to work in the circle area, which is Rhode Island, because it was the northernmost path of Sandy. So people were kind of shaken, but they weren't afraid. And I think that kind of cultural imaginary is really important. I think you have it here. I don't think that you have the memory of a terrible storm, but you do understand the risk that you're living with. And I think that creates more possibility. It's very difficult. Rebuild is essential right after a devastation, but the question really as designers is, okay, how can we work not through fear, but through optimism? So this is New Jersey, just to give you an example of, this is like, you know, in the it's also blown out, sorry. But this is New Jersey, right following Sandy, extremely built out condition. Rhode Island is also much less built out on the coast. And after the Army Corps came in and restored after Sandy, this is what it looked like. So this is dune restoration. This is dune restoration. This is the alternate configuration, and this is dune restoration. I don't think I have to say anything. Do I have to say anything? And then we come in and we plant that with American beach grass in plugs, which will not hold up to the storm. It will hold up to micro events, undoubtedly, and it's very important as a substrate. But it's not going to take that kind of power. Anyways, just to give you that visual, that's what a lot of my colleagues were working on. Very, very difficult states in post-Sandy conditions, and we turned to Rhode Island. Now, Rhode Island boasts about 420 miles of coastline, which is also why we were attracted to it, making it the second longest coastline in America in relation, after Hawaii, in relation to its landmass. So this is the current shoreline condition, and with the mapping we were looking at, this is the future shoreline. Not from sea level rise per se, but from an accelerated warming, which will transform these coastal wetlands. So a collaboration between the loss of salt marshes, which primarily fringe the coast, and sea level rise itself. So that means that most of the land, there's about 20% loss of Rhode Island as a state. That's rather tremendous. I know that you're here and you also see, I mean, I'm not going to pull a Dr. Wan list right now, but the sheer velocity and scale of that is something to keep in mind and be mindful of. So again, very quickly, I'm sorry it's already been 30 minutes, Dennis, but we thought we would be working in this kind of salt marsh condition and back bay condition along the western edge of Rhode Island. But we ended up actually in the Sakonnet River, which is, can I do this? Do you have a pointer? No. Oh yeah, here, which is this river right here, you see. Sorry, it's all funky. So we worked in this slip, but we took a lot of cues from the vulnerabilities in the urbanized coast. One of the reasons for that was the run-up and our idea that if we are going to look at planting hummock forests in a transitional salt marsh, that we'd have to do it systemically. It's not about one site, but it's about sites starting to work together. So in this right-hand map, on my back, here. So this is actually a national park, a bird sanctuary. And this is a fishing town called the Hummocks. It's actually called the Hummocks. And this is Warren. So most of the population is in Warren. But the run-up in the Sakonnet, which you start to see from the sections, and also the light pink, the run-up of the Sakonnet is such that basically it funnels up through the Sakonnet, especially the surge, and then it kind of lands in Warren. And Warren is the second largest town after Providence. Providence has a hurricane barrier. Warren doesn't. So we looked at how, again, through resilience, through collaboration, we could extend planting that would attenuate wave action in some of the lowlands rather than creating more open water, which would increase runup, so that you slowed down the impact as it reached Warren. So there are the 3 sites a little more. Again, light pink is the inundation from the last map. So you see that the middle scale, the middle site, would be completely open water in a storm event. And that would just increase wave action, right? The water just moves faster. So we did a lot of modeling, a lot of stuff. I'm going to go a little bit more quickly. Here's an example of some of the, basically screenshots almost that we were working with, and how you could start to move things away. Also very interesting in Rhode Island is this is a freshwater drinking water supply. So it's in a tricky spot. So we relocated the drinking water supply. That's the site. I'm going to go a little bit more quickly. And we started to show them how there are these hummocks happening in other salt marshes, and what could you do with woody species, not just any woody species, but in particular, woody species that could sprout back. So the disturbance itself was embedded, again, I'm going to bring it back to the beginning of the presentation, in plant behavior. So some plants, when they're blown out, they die. Some, from the stump or from the root, create much more meristematic activity because they understand that they're about to die. So they sprout. This is what coppice forests are built on from thousands of years of burning for fuel in Europe. So if you provoke an unstable system, you're kind of creating a resilient attitude. So we specified plants that could sprout back, and we looked to plant biologists to tell us a lot about how this happens and what happens in turn. And what we discovered, which I frankly could imagine but didn't know enough about, is that if the leader blows out, typically the root zone doubles in size. Well, if the root zone is doubling in size, then plants are structural. They will hold soil, and they will hold soil much more effectively than concrete, which will get blown out, and then a bulldozer will come in and build it back. That is not resilience, that's just, you could say that's restoration. But what if the actual material of planting becomes the resilient measure in itself? So again, this is altissima. Sprouting becomes a feature, not a concern. In a typical landscape, I took this in winter so you could really see the sprouting. In a typical landscape, this is problematic because we want the form of the plant, and we mow it. And then we mow it, and then it comes back twice as thick below ground, and we don't see that. And then we keep fighting it, and then we call it an aggressive species. So what if you design, not with plant form, which is, I want a 10-meter multi-stem, to frame my view because I'm going to turn here because it's beautiful, that's wonderful. At a certain scale. But what if you plant the plant because you want it to actually start to perform alongside the gray infrastructure? What if green infrastructure could be measured along gray infrastructure? Again, it would also take, for landscape architects, a redefinition of the word tree, which is tree is a plant. A tree can be defined as a plant that, when undisturbed, this is a definition, develops a single erect woody trunk. A shrub, on the other hand, is a woody plant that, when undisturbed, branches spontaneously at or below ground level to produce multiple stems. In general, a tree will develop secondary trunks in response to injury or disturbance to its primary trunk or root system, to displacement of its primary stem out of the normal vertical orientation, or to a dramatic change in surrounding environmental conditions. That also sounds like a great definition for building a resilient detail. So while some of the forms of typical plant life are understood for cultural value, what if we take behavior into account for values of resilience? And so these are some of the morphologies of how roots and stumps sprout, and so the list that we developed for these forests was essentially based on these kinds of root morphologies that allow individual plants to spread, and then we redraw everything for the Army Corps as a kind of construction detail that takes into account, I'll go a little bit more quickly, the hummock formation, and then the inclusion of rhizome and rhizomatic activity to attenuate and still create cultural value, so that we have a different attitude toward what planting a forest is, what plants that are planted deliberately to break, fall, and resprout look like, and how the root activity starts to double, triple, and so on. Interestingly, it took some time for the Army Corps to get there with us. So we also redraw the plants themselves as construction details because, again, if I go back to that first detail, we need to reimagine our details as much as anything. It's not just about rescaling a kind of green chunk, but it's actually about understanding the metrics that you're working with and then recasting them for, let's say, their behavioral attributes so that you can communicate with the same folks that are looking at changing the details and have no idea how to. We need to redesign our details. So there's our sassafras hummock recently doing so well, and we use it as a model and go back and photograph it whenever possible. So I think I can also just stop there. That's great. Thank you very much. I don't know if, yeah.